All right, let's jump right into today's explainer, where we're going to impartially unpack some incredibly intense comparative theology from Nabil Qureshi. We are looking directly at his deep dive, No God But One, Allah or Jesus, which is this really rigorous examination of the historical and theological bedrock of both Islam and Christianity. And, for millions of people out there, navigating the stark differences between these two massive worldviews, it's not just some casual coffee shop debate. It is literally a defining central conflict of their entire lives.
What's so compelling about Qureshi's source material is that he doesn't frame this theology as a dry, dusty academic exercise. He treats it as a deeply human struggle with just immense stakes. And that comes from his totally unique vantage point. He was actually raised as a devout Muslim, fiercely defended his faith, but then went through this grueling, years-long historical investigation that eventually led him to convert to Christianity. So he's really grounding all this high-level theology in real, tangible human consequences.
To truly grasp those stakes, the text introduces us to Sarah Fatima al-Mutairi. This is the exact life or death question facing Fatima, a 26-year-old Saudi woman. After a really deep spiritual search, she actually converted to Christianity. Now, she kept it a secret, right? Because in her country, leaving Islam carries the death penalty. But during a heated argument, her brother found her secret journals on her computer. He literally locked her in her room, giving her just 4 hours to repent or face execution for blasphemy.
Part 1. The Human Stakes. A Costly Conversion.
Moving right into Part 2. Two different solutions. Diagnosing the human condition.
Fatima's completely terrifying dilemma actually echoes the author's own journey. Qureshi himself lost his friends, his close family ties, and faced death threats when he left Islam, proving that for millions, making this choice is absolutely not trivial. Qureshi argues that to really understand these fates, you have to look at how they diagnose the human condition. In the Islamic worldview, the core problem of humanity is simply ignorance. Mankind just needs to be guided on how to live properly. And the solution to that ignorance? It's a law to follow. That law is Sharia, which translates beautifully to the way to water, which is a super powerful concept for a faith originating in the desert, right? It implies that following this specific code is literally the path to life itself. It tells a believer exactly how to please Allah. On the flip side, the Christian worldview, according to the text, says humanity's problem is not just mere ignorance, but deep, fundamental brokenness and sin. It argues that humanity is totally incapable of fixing itself just by following a set of rules. Therefore, it offers a person, Jesus, as the solution rather than a code of conduct. The gospel, or the good news, is the message that God himself steps in to pay the penalty for this rebellion, transforming the human heart from the inside out. It's really fascinating how wildly these approaches diverge. Islam focuses on guiding the ignorant through rules, while Christianity focuses on healing the broken through a transformed heart. In Islam, salvation is achieved by following the way of the law. In Christianity, the way is explicitly defined as the person of Jesus.
Which brings us to Part 3. Tawhid versus the Trinity. Understanding the nature of God.
To fully grasp why these solutions are so different, Qureshi says we have to look much deeper at the very nature of God himself. Because what a society believes about God totally dictates how they view the world, their overarching purpose, and frankly, each other. Tawhid represents God as an absolute monad, completely singular, and absolutely uncompromised by any division or external attributes. This is the central, absolute defining doctrine of Islamic theology. Allah is one, period.
So the crucial point here is this concept of absolute unity, which actually sparked some incredibly intense historical debates among Muslims. Think about it for a second. If Allah is absolutely undivided, how can the Quran, which is considered the very speech of Allah, exist eternally alongside him? Because if the Quran is eternal, doesn't that inherently mean something exists alongside God, which would compromise his absolute oneness? That exact philosophical puzzle sparked literally centuries of major conflict.
Now, the Christian Trinity, on the other hand, represents a composite unity. The source text points out that the Hebrew word for one, used in the famous Jewish declaration, the Lord is one, is echad, and that's a word often used for a composite unity, like a cluster of grapes, or a husband and wife becoming one. The Trinity teaches that three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, share one divine being.
Qureshi highlights that this fundamental difference is a total game changer. It means the Islamic God, being an absolute monad, is non-relational until creation.
Allah literally could not be intrinsically merciful or gracious until he created something to actually receive that mercy. Meanwhile, the triune God Christianity has always been eternally relational, the Father, Son, and Spirit loving each other perfectly before the universe even existed.
Let's look at Part 4, History of Divine Doctrine, Forging Theology Through Fire. Now, these complex theologies didn't just casually appear in a vacuum. Both faiths rigorously tested their definitions of God, and sometimes they did so through the absolute crucible of extreme persecution. We often just assume these core doctrines were settled peacefully by scholars in a room, but the historical record shows us something entirely different and a lot more intense. Take the Mithna, for instance. This was essentially an Islamic inquisition. Caliph al-Ma'mun aligned with rationalists who declared the Quran was a created book, specifically to protect that absolute unity of Tawhid we talked about. His forces relentlessly interrogated, flogged, and literally executed orthodox thinkers who believed the Quran was eternal, because they viewed that belief as a blasphemous threat to Allah's indivisibility. They even paraded the severed head of one such thinker, Ahmad bin Nasr al-Kuzi, right through the streets of Baghdad as a warning. Similarly, Nicaea was a major theological battleground, though under totally different circumstances. Scarred and severely persecuted Christian bishops, many were literally missing eyes or limbs from the brutal Diocletian persecutions, gathered together in AD 325. They were there to settle the Arian controversy, which claimed Jesus was created by God rather than being eternally God. Over 99% of those 318 bishops firmly established and reaffirmed the traditional teaching that Jesus was undeniably God.
And that takes us to Part 5, Worshipping the Same God, Qureshi's Relational Conclusion.
Bringing all of this analysis into practical focus, Qureshi's ultimate thesis becomes crystal clear when you compare these paradigms directly. The differing natures of Allah and Yahweh create completely different blueprints for human existence. You have ignorance versus brokenness, law versus a person, a singular monad versus an eternally relational composite unity.
Digging deep into the texts, Qureshi observes that the Quran presents Allah as a transcendent master, issuing laws from behind a veil, and notably, never adopting the title of a father seeking intimacy with his children. In fact, the Quran explicitly rejects the very idea that humans are God's children. In stark contrast, Qureshi points out that the Christian God is portrayed precisely as a father, deeply seeking an intimate relationship and offering pretty extravagant grace. So Qureshi concludes that these are absolutely not just academic differences. They are the very foundation for how we treat each other and how we view our core purpose on Earth. Think about it. If the ultimate reality of the universe is a God who demands submission to a law, then society naturally models itself on rule following and mastery. But if the ultimate reality is a God whose very essence is an eternal, selfless relationship, then society models itself on intimacy and self-sacrifice. Qureshi captures this thought perfectly, stating that since God is the greatest being, relational and loving, relationships and love are the most important commandments for mankind. It's the argument that the Christian doctrine of a triune, relational God inherently anchors human altruism. The idea is we are driven to love selflessly, not just to earn some future reward or avoid a terrible punishment, but because humanity is actually made in the image of a God whose very nature is selfless love. It grounds altruism not in basic utility, but in our core identity. Which brings us right back to Fatima, locked in her room, staring down that absolutely terrifying ultimatum. The theological lines drawn between Tawhid and the Trinity, between Sharia and the Gospel, those are the very lines defining her brother's violent rage and her own desperate search for peace. So, as we remember Fatima's harrowing dilemma, we leave you to consider, how does the God a society chooses fundamentally define the humanity it lives out?